In the following presentation, allow me to establish three key principles of existence insofar as something I consider very important to the world as it is right now is something that is called existential realism. Now, affiliated with the notion of existential realism is the idea that things for the subject, historical, politically, so on and so forth, where regards their own process of going through the mirror phase, the essential phase of realization that one exists as such, that one is a being, and to say that this is something that is coordinated by one's initial recognition of what a concept is, what the idea is in the early stages of life, when one realizes that seeing an object presents one with the notion that the object has meaning, and it also, not only does it have meaning, but it has meaning to the subject, to the child. And insofar as it has meaning to the child, it also has meaning to others in some way, others that are other than the child. So in a very sort of simplistic fashion, we look at the notion of this sort of evolving throughout someone's entire life, from the point where they are the sort of Freudian pregenital beings, children looking to identify objects as something significant to them, and seeing that when that object is lost, that they have lost a part of themselves in some sense of the term. But yet they do not yet have the idea of how they are in Act 2 actually identifying with the other, and the other is not something abstract to a child. It is their immediate environment. So the idea of subjectivity is already established in the mind of the child as such, and their psychology dwells with the outer objects of the planetary sphere are sort of not determinations upon their subjectivity in the sense that they are unmediated, so they are most certainly mediated. Now, as we work through the process of a subject evolving, as all of us Homo sapiens and really developed human beings evolve in some sense, if we were sort of to suggest that Homo sapiens had now become a new species, for instance, we would perhaps be going into a terrain of consciousness that one does not necessarily wish or desire to pursue, but that we could see how evolving human reality would result in something that was formed by its own initial stages of identifying with the object that exists for something such as a child, someone born into the world. And in that sense, the notion between the idea that a physical object bears as much significance to someone very innocent the same way it does someone that is perhaps not as innocent, that has evolved into the world as such, as a place in what I would call ethical flux. So the notion that when one develops and one evolves one's ideas as a subject, things become more objective at some point. They become more objective, they become more about the outside experience of reality. And that is what I intend to pursue in terms of existential realism, being actually abstracted by the subject and realizing the subject realizes their own essence as an existential realism, as something that is out there, that has to do with the experience of the world as such, but it is filtered through all the varying levels of reality presented one, and not without compromise. The situation of compromise is certainly intrinsic to subjectivity. So once the initial stages of subjective development have become objects that are more ontological for subjects in the Freudian sense, this sort of the French idea of the relevé du conscience, the elevated ideas that are entering into consciousness and are becoming these sort of suppressed wishes that now become objects for the subject. And really in this sort of essential triadic formation of subjectivity, one needs to return to the idea that taking these elevations of the subconscious, childhood repressed desires, and bringing them into an objective consciousness and early self-development and self-realization becomes the object, and then must essentially return to the subject in some sense. So the process whereby this becomes a possibility is what I call an existential possibility. So the existential possibility is the idea that someone can arrive at something that is actually horizontal to subjectivity. For the notion that something must be very mediate or immediate and unmediated. When I say mediate, I don't mean immediate in the sense of unmediated. The notion that an unmediated particularity, the idea that we project ourselves intrinsically as subjects that are seeking something in this existential horizon, is something other than the notion that we are something that identifies as subjects already, that we have already sort of transformed reality in such a way as subjectivity is realized within us. Therefore, existence, our notion of what would happen would be what would happen essentially is that the identity between subject and existential horizon would realize a place where the notion that the existential horizon were not concomitant to subjectivity, and it's never concomitant to subjectivity actually, but I think that the psychological notion that self-identity is produced by its own existential instantiation as a self-identity and reflexive thereupon is part of the process whereby identifying the object is not something just simply physical or objective from the sort of forms of being that are other than ourselves, that present us with the notion of objectivity in the early stages of self-realization, forward to the process whereby we become subjects again and realize this object as something that is sort of within itself, yet it is also within us. The object is within us as the object. So the notion that we would sort of create some sort of moral universe whereby the object was not necessarily driven by some other subject that was self-same. A self-same object, for instance, self-same subject, but that was actually an object that possessed our object, would be sort of presupposing ideas about what we are or what we are not, based upon the genus principle of Aristotle, whereby people are all of a certain genus, and they're sometimes someone would even wonder if they had relatives that they had not known, but the fact of the matter is the genus of planet Earth supports this notion that there is even a multitude within its generation, its self-generating principle, and the genus of subjectivity. Therefore, where we supervene as sort of the genus subjects of our own self-identification, we process reality in such a way as to become social experiences that are not just simply sort of randomly abstracting objects from sort of a consumerist social reality, but looking at things in terms of their existential proportions and possibly the substantiation of what drives consciousness forward, and not just consciousness, but actually the notion between subject and object is not a divide or a split, or subject and object as separate entities that subjectivity would be prone to concede itself to the object in any way, at any level of Freudian compromise, whether or not we were prone to identify ourselves as that person we wish to be when we were a child, and that would be elevated into consciousness. And that would constantly be sort of an albatross to our own self-identification later in life, because we always projected the notion that the truth was different than what we were when we were children, so we constantly, consistently, and effectively actualize ourselves in the attempt to self-realize, whereby we project that initial formation of self-identity upon others in a sense. So the idea between others being part of the social identity, or being part of how we actuate ourselves as possibilities, is sort of effective in the process of self-evaluation, whereby one is to realize whether or not they are with sort of situations whereby the development of human identity is finding itself in all of its varying forms of identity, not simply temporalized to past, present, and future, but actually all the identities that existed in past, and all the repressions of the past and openings of the past, and all of the repressions of the present and openings of the present, and all the futures that are upon the horizon that are possible repressions of the unification of the subject with its own existential realism, that arrives at the possibility of abstracting something, not necessarily from its social form, but abstracting something from the substantiated claims that are effectively notions conceived by the subject, yet not notions conceived by the object. So the notions conceived by the object are other than the ones conceived by the subject. So effectively, what subjectivity must do is it must create some form of it's quite imperfect in that it's not an ethereal form as such, nor can we sort of return to Spinoza's idea of the unified field theory, which was presupposed by him and realized in the Einstein theory. But effectively, what we have arrived at is not based upon quantum reality. as I had suggested. It is more based upon, as some has suggested, the notion that quantum reality is this sort of form of, I have spoken of quantum reality as this sort of notion that the division of matter will become formed by itself, and that matter will reform itself in a sense, so that human subjects will become again the very corporeal forms that has been presupposed by the developments in science and so on and so forth. So the notion that quantum reality is for me the idea that actually it's in a sense the same thing as is proposed by philosophy, that new physics, for instance, could enter into the spheres of activity of biopolitics and ontogenesis, and that you could actually develop a sort of modulatory fluxion between particles that would make an entirety of new forms of kinesthetic abstraction possible. So it's this idea of kinesthetic abstraction, of essentially stemming from the work of neuroscientists and initially from Edmund Husserl, the idea that kinesthetic abstraction would be, and Paul Ricoeur, for instance, the idea that the voluntary and the involuntary would be this abstraction of a kinesthetic possibility, that the positing of the image actually has ontic consequences to it. So the ontic consequences are reified, in the Lukácsian sense. They're actually appropriated and become sort of the neurodynamics of a subject's existence as they develop in they're outside of their own sort of Freudian development of the object and into this sort of development of how to identify as a sort of neurological being on the planet and concern myself with other issues that have more to do with the development of society and develop socio-political developments, elements, environmental concerns, etc., etc. And then someone is neurologically sort of affected by these components that are metaphysical components to them for an ontologist, and then are developed into their essential, the essential formation of their being, which is the originary point of that was something they were seeing within themselves, and then it actuated as a relationship between subject and object at some point within the sort of process of self-realization, education, and professional development, perhaps, not necessarily into the elements, yet outside of the elements or within the elements, and just seeing that as extending beyond the space of where the edge is presented to us as not an argument for what I have presupposed in existential realism, but the notion that its universalization would be proposed within a limiting process whereby the substantiation of essence would be proposed as a function of its essential triadic to what I call tetradic formation, into realizing that within the quatrain there is the essential notion of the tetrad, which I call the existential horizon. So the limitation is not a limitation upon the tetrad, it's a limitation upon the substantiation of essence that has gone through its process of objective self-identification into a return to the subject as a not an essentialism, but a notion that essence, the essence of the process is contained within itself, whereby the substance is actuated by its own sense of freedom and responsibility, or responsible freedom, and none of those, but in actuality, its own identification as the substance of its own human process, whereby the substance of its own human process is actuated within both the object and the subject at the same time, becomes its original point of confluence that may then proceed to identify with the moral universe and concede itself to notions of the possibilities that are equally impossible. But to give the notion of impossibility the adjunct of the notion of something concretely possible. Thank you for watching.